Hello everyone, I hope you are well and I hope the voice is good and obvious. I hope you can hear me very well. And firstly, welcome to my presentation about economic sanctions and embargoes of Western countries on Eastern countries as you see on the picture. And I wish I would do this presentation face to face. It would be better, but as you know, unfortunately conditions are not allowed to do it face to face. And it will be maybe my voice is like sometimes it could be bad, but I'm sorry about it. I will try to do my best, and let's start the presentation with the second page. And yes, as I said before, my presentation is about economic sanctions and embargoes of Western countries on Eastern countries. Firstly, I want to talk about what is economic sanctions, as you see in the picture. And economic sanctions are a penalty levied on another country or on individual citizens of another country. It is an instrument of foreign policy and the economic pressure that can be described as a sort of carrot and stick approach to dealing with international trade and politics. A country has a number of different types of sanctions at its disposal. While some are more widely used than others, the general goal of each is to force a change in behavior on other country. Sanctions are categorized in several ways. One way to describe them is by the number of parties using the sanctions. An unilateral sanction means that a single country is enacting the sanctions, while a multilateral sanction means that a group of bloc of countries is supporting its use. Since multilateral sanctions are enacted by groups of countries, they can be considered less risky because no one no one country is on the line for the sanction result. Unilateral sanctions are riskier but can be very efficient if enacted by an economically powerful country. And let's continue with other page. Also, it's gonna be about what is economic sanctions and embargoes. Um, the immediate impact of an import sanctions on the target country is that the country's exports are not purchased abroad, depending on the target country's economic reliance on the exported good or services. This could be a crippling effect. This is like literally meaning of what economic sanctions and embargoes. The sanctions might cause the sort of political and economic instability that results in a more totalitarian regime, or it can create a failed state due to power vacuum. The target country's suffering is ultimately borne by its citizens, who in times of crisis maybe so defeat the regime in charge rather than overthrow. A crippled country can be breeding ground for extremism, which is a scenario that the initiating country would probably prefer not to deal with. And this is like literally meaning of economic sanctions and embargoes. And as most of you know, in our daily life, in the news, we are always hearing what economic sanctions or embargoes is. Western countries, as most of you know, strong countries, like the meaning of Western countries in my literature is strong countries. That's mean like Western countries imposing economic sanctions and embargoes on the eastern countries because to change of their behavior, because these behaviors are not appropriate to their interests. And for example, US doing on Iran, or US EU doing on Turkey, or many countries. And as most of you know, Western countries, for example, EU and US is imposing more than 50 countries, imposing economic sanctions more than 50 countries in the world, such a big number. And let's continue with other page. And why do countries impose economic sanctions? In this page, the topic is why do countries impose economic sanctions? I would like to ask you this question face to face, but I'm alone here, and I would also you're gonna answer this question in your inside when you listen to this presentation. You can impose sanctions against another state. This is explanation for why do countries impose economic sanctions. You can impose sanctions against another state because you want to see a change in behavior of the other state, as I told you before in other page. The idea is that the populations get angry and will demand from its own government to do something to rectify the situation. Countries can also introduce sanctions in retaliation to other countries' sanctions. For example, Russia did this in 2014 in response to restrictions put on them by the EU and USA. It was a good movement because EU and US always doing against some countries. This time is different, another part. And economic sanctions are used as a tool of foreign policy by many governments. Not many governments actually, like strong governments, strong organizations such as like US, EU, or Russia, China. These countries are using these these economic sanctions and embargoes as a power, and doing these sanctions, if something against their interest, they are doing these sanctions on the small countries to change their behavior or strategy. And they can be also used as coercive measure for achieving particular policy goals related to trade or for humanitarian violations. Economic sanctions, on the other hand, are used as an alternative weapon instead of going to the war to achieve desired outcomes. And in my literature, economic sanctions and embargoes is like cold wars because they are not doing like physically war. They are destroying their economy. Like, I mean, the countries who imposing economic sanctions, they are not physically but economically, like, the killing the other country, like literally they are. It's like in my literature, as I told you before, it's mean like totally cold war. And that's why countries impose economic sanctions on other countries. That's the explanation of this word. And let's continue with other page. And in this graphic is literally amazing. As you see, the daily, not yearly, the economic sanctions embargoes are increased each year. And recently, as you see in the blue, like dark blue line and other like soft blue line, you can see like EU and US sanctions are increasing, like increased every year. And in this graphic depicts the yearly percent of the sanctions imposed by the US versus the percent of sanctions imposed by the UN, the EU, and the rest of the world. The US has been the most frequent imposer of unilateral sanctions throughout 1950 and 2019. It's not a big surprise because in every news we are hearing that US like imposing economic sanctions on a country. The percentage of the US sanctions increasing during the Trump administration, and there is no also difference between Biden and Trump. Biden is just kind of soft and kind of diplomatic. And in this graphic, you can also see the increasing economic sanctions imposed by the US, as I told you before, UN and EU since 1950. Increasing sanctions with the developing and globalizing the world are showing in the graphic. Sanctions to me means the world modern Cold War, as I told you before. If a state does not like the strategic moves of another state or acts outside its interest, it imposes economic sanctions. On the opposing sides, such a pathetic situation because the country who is like imposed economic sanctions by other country, they are not doing anything and they just have to fix themselves, their behaviors, or they have to leave their interests. For example, Turkey is like looking for oil reserves in Mediterranean Sea, and as most of you know, geographically, or all border of Turkey is in Mediterranean Sea. Turkey has a right to look for oil in the Mediterranean Sea, but EU, UK, US imposing economic sanctions on Turkey because of no reason. It's like such a pathetic situation. And for example, on the other hand, the USA imposing sanctions on Syria, and it's also in Syria militarily. US is in Syria, and US government argues that one of the reasons for the sanctions and being in Syria militarily is border security of the US. what a funny excuse, really. Like, where is US? Another continent? Where is Syria? It's in the Middle East, but excuse of the sanctions are border. US is like completely like out of mind in this situation because they are imposing sanctions on Syria and they are militarily in Syria and they are saying that it's our border security. We have to be there. We have to impose economic sanctions. And let's continue with other page. Of course, superstar of economic sanctions is US. As you see, how many countries are uh, getting economic sanctions on US, and these countries, most of them economically suffering. The people are famine, like hunger. Also, inflation rate is increasing like crazy. For example, in Turkey, like officially inflation rate is more than 20, but the feeling in inside, like in the country, is like more than 40. At the same time, in Iran, like last year, as far as I know, in the Iran inflation rate was like 35%. Also Syria, like there's no even say something about Syria. Countries in the war and at the same time economic sanctions and completely suffering. And also in this page we are seeing the superstar of sanctions, as I told you before. Superstar of tight sanctions is US because since 1950 the US has been the most frequent user of international sanctions in the world, accounting for more than one-third of all observed sanctions cases. For various reasons, the US sanctions have been of keen interest to scholars working on sanctions research, and the Trump administration imposed more sanctions than any other US administration because Trump is like, I'm sorry, but Trump is a crazy leader. Illustrates the domination utilization of sanctions by the US since 1950 to achieve its foreign policy objectives, as well as the increase in the frequency of their usage by the Trump administration. The US has been the single most frequent user of sanctions throughout this period. On average, more than 35% of all sanctions during 1950-2019 were imposed by the US. And let's continue with other page. As you see in this page, the United States has nearly 8,000 economic sanctions in place, and the muscles behind any area of US financial sanctions derives from the reach and power of the US dollar as the lead currency in the global economy. The dollar is the world's lead currency because it meets three key conditions. The first one is the United States dollar is fully tradable and exchanged at relatively low costs. The US government does not restrict the purchase or sale of dollar. The second one is the dollar holds its value against other currencies, always, like from the history also. The United States is still considered a stable and open market economy. Current tariff vagaries, and at the end of the last year, just under 62% of all central banks' reserves were held in US dollars. And third and last one is the United States is still the largest economy in the world, equivalent to 24% of global GDP, such a huge number. And below is a snapshot from International Monetary Fund comparing the world's largest economies. We have a larger money supply providing liquidity for the global economy, and they're just using the like advantage of their currency. And all world market is like turning with United States dollar, and they're saying that, hey, we have strong money, strong military, let's impose economic sanctions on the country who we don't like what they're doing, to change their strategy, to change their interests, their plans, everything. And let's continue with other page. US types of sanctions on this page. In this graphic depicts the types of sanctions employed by the US, and also in this page you see like different types of sanctions: military sanctions, arms sanctions, trade sanctions, financial sanctions, travel sanctions, other sanctions, and also confirming the increasing in the absolute number of sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. In the recent years, you can see here Trump is like in Trump term, it's increased, like economic sanctions are increased, while trade sanctions appear to have risen significantly during the Obama years. There is a strong decline in 2017 due to the abolition of many active Obama sanctions in 2016. In contrast, arms sanctions remained relatively steady during the Trump years between 2016 and 2019, as you see in the graphic, and military sanctions increasing marginally. The Trump and Obama administration differ in their imposition of smart and sanctions. Specifically, we observe a significant rise in the number of smart sanctions under Trump's presidency. A possible explanation for this relative increase in the number of smart sanctions, which is consonant with a general worldwide trend, is that by design, smart sanctions aim to influence policymakers in sanctioned countries by imposing economic pain on targeted individuals, companies, and/or economic sectors. And let's continue with other page. And it's in this page, as I told you, like we saw the travel sanctions, financial sanctions, different type of sanctions the US imposed to other countries, and recently in like 2013, 2019, how it increased. And let's continue with other page. And in this page, as you know, Iran has abundant oil reserves. Oil reserves significantly affect Iran's economy. What you see in this cards, in this graphics, you can decline in Iran's Brent crude oil and barrel sales with the EU and the US sanctions. And as I told you, it's like significant. Oil is a significant effect in Iran's economy, and US making sanctions on their oil, and they are not selling oil, they can't, and that's why economy is like slowly declining, and they're also Iran currency. At the start of 2000, on the other hand, at the start of 2018, Iran's crude oil production reached 2.8 million barrels per day. According to data gathered from secondary sources by the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, as you know, OPEC, the country was exporting about 2.3 million like every year, and most of the oil was bought by 8 countries or territories that were granted 6-month exceptions by the US when sanctions on the Iranian energy sector took effect. These countries are like China from east to west: China, India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. A condition of the waivers was the importers reduced their purchases of Iranian oil, and by April 2019, Iran's oil exports had fallen to 1 million BPD on average, according to Bloomberg, that recording to reduce the government's revenue by billions of dollars. 2 months later, President Trump decided to allow the exemptions to expire and declared that he intended to bring Iran's oil exports to zero. By October 2019, Iran's crude oil production had fallen to 2.1 million BPD on average, according to OPEC's data. On the other hand, Bloomberg reported that only 260,000 on BPD on average was being exported. And as you see, like the lines are always going down in this graphics. And let's continue with other page. The Iranian real is their currency, the currency of Iran, and as you see in the graphic, the Iran currency has evolved in value, and you can see the line, and as far as I know, like 52%, like it's lost the value of the Iranian real is valued. The real, because of the economic sanctions, of course, the real's slide has been attributed to Iran economy problems and high demand for foreign currency among ordinary Iranians who have seen the value of their savings eroded and their purchasing power cut sharply. The rial has regained some of its value since September 2018 when the Central Bank of Iran released more dollars into the market and authorities charged down on currency dealers as prices reached a record low of 176,000 to the dollar. And Iran's currency was have also led to shortages of important goods and products that are made with the raw materials from abroad, most notably babies' nappies. Even babies' nappies, as you see, they like such a dramatic position, and living costs have risen dramatically. President Rouhani is like president of Iran and managed to get inflation down to 9% in 2018, but the IMF estimated that it surged to 30.5% in 2018 and projected that it would reach 35% in 2019. Food and beverage prices were up by 61% year on year, and the price of tobacco was up like by 80%. And let's continue with other page. And also in this page, thought sanctions imposed on Iran by the US are designed to target core parts of the Islamic Republic's economy with the aim of pressuring Tehran into altering its direction and cheesing its mailing activities. And in a news published by the BBC, you can find with what Iranian citizens think and feel about the sanctions in the link below. And you should for sure research on this link what people of Iran thinking about these sanctions. You can see how people are dramatically suffering because of economical reasons, because as you know, like inflation rate is like more than 30%, and yeah, people are literally suffering and dying slowly because of these sanctions. And let's continue with the other page. And Turkey is also one of the country who's like encountering sanctions against Western countries, as I told you, because as I told you before, like because of Mediterranean Sea, because of Turkey's buying S-400 missiles from Russia. Countries just want to do defense itself. Like also the country is like one member of NATO, and US just saying that you can just buy our missiles. You can't buy missiles from Russia, but also Turkey is an independent country, like implying sanctions because of this reason is completely nonsense for me. And the in this page you're seeing that the and on the other hand, EU also like imposing sanctions on Turkey in response to its gas drilling activities in Western Mediterranean. The sanctions reflect ongoing tensions between Turkey and Greece, and in particular disputes over the sovereignty of certain Greek islands. In 2019, Turkey began has drilling efforts off the coast of Cyprus, which the EU judged to be a violation of the island's sovereignty. The EU's Turkey sanctions were increased in November 2019 and targeted persons planning, like preparing, participating in, directing, or assisting drilling activities not authorized by Cyprus, along with persons providing financial assistance for those activities. The sanctions imposed asset freezes and travel bans against their targets, and since their introduction, have seen two members of Turkey, state-owned Turkish Petroleum Corporation, added to the EU sanctions list in November 2020. And the EU Council agreed to extend its sanctions measures against Turkey from 12 months until November 2021. And on the other hand, like when we talk about the US imposed sanctions on Turkey in December 2020 in response to the Turkish government's acquisition of military technology from Russia, as I mentioned before. The violation of devaluation in question occurred when the Turkish Presidency of Defense in Industries, a civil institution set up to manage the supply of military equipment, both as surface to air missile system from Rosabornum export, a Russian state-owned weapons exporter. Turkey's transaction with Russia violated secondary sanctions that prohibit third countries from dealing with countries that are directly sanctioned by the US government. The US sanctions regime targeting Turkey focuses on the SSB, meaning US persons may continue to conduct transactions with other Turkish firms and individuals. Although the sanctions were imposed by the Trump administration, at the same time, President Biden has continued to take a hard line against Turkey, indicating that the restrictive measures are set to continue. And as I mentioned before, EU sanctions. The EU imposed sanctions against Turkey in response to its gas drilling activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's the only reason. As I told you before, Turkey is looking for oil reserves in Mediterranean Sea and Aegean Sea, and the EU is just imposing sanctions on Turkey because of nothing. And as most of recently, Turkish economy and Turkish lira is declining, like actually literally collapsing, because like 3 months ago, 1 euro was like 10 Turkish liras. Now 1 euro is like 15 Turkish liras. It happened in just a few months, and this situation is like completely nonsense, because sanctions are nonsense, because as I told you before, geographically Turkey is like all Turkey, like western coast is in Aegean and Mediterranean Sea. Turkey has right to research oil on it, but UK, EU, and US imposing sanctions on Turkey just because of nothing, just because of this reason. It's like Turkish citizens' own right, and EU saying that it's not your right. It's Greece can research it. Greece should research it because European, and Greece is a member of European, and they are supporting their own ally. And after also in 2016, a military coup happened by Fethullah Gülen. After economic sanctions, military coup, and political instability in 2016 and 2021, Turkish currency, as I told you before, and debt crisis in an ongoing financial and economic crisis in Turkey. It was characterized by the Turkish lira plunging in value, high inflation, rising borrowing costs, and correspondingly rising loan defaults. The crisis was caused by the Turkish economy excessive current account deficit and the large amounts of private foreign currency denominated debt, in combination with the President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism and his unorthodox ideas about interest rate policy. Some analysts also stress the leveraging effects of the geopolitical frictions with the United States. Investment inflows had already been declining in the period leading up to the crisis, owing to Erdogan instigating political disagreements with countries that were major sources of such inflows, such as Germany, France, and the Netherlands, and at the same time many EU countries, many countries from EU. And following the 2016 COP attempt, the government sized the assets of those states were involved, even if their ties to the COP were attenuated. Erdogan has not taken seriously concerns that foreign companies investing in Turkey might be deterred by the country's political instability. Other factors include worries about the decreasing value of lira. It's called, in general, by the way, Turkish lira, which threatens to eat into investors' provide margins. Investment inflows have also declined because Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism has quelled free and factual reporting by financial analysts in Turkey. And at the same time, as I told you, authoritarianism of Erdogan also could be a reason of increasing economic sanctions and embargoes, because it's been 21 years almost. Erdogan is like a prime minister or president of Turkey, and let's continue. And this is the last page. This is end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. As a result, these are the only two countries that have been subject to unnecessary political reasons and economic sanctions to protect their national interests. As I showed on one page of my slide, Western countries, I mean USA and EU or UK, impose sanctions on more than 50 countries around the world, and they forced these countries to which they impose country sanctions to remain in financial and moral difficulties. And this was the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something. And I hoped also when I'm saying something or listening to when you read the page, you would attend to my question, you answered my questions, and you attend my ideas. And I hope you enjoyed again. Have a nice day. Have a healthy day. Thank you very much.